So the iPhone 5 was one of those devices that came out a couple of years ago, and to be honest, this was a pretty big upgrade coming from the previous generation of iPhones. I don't think it was the biggest upgrade of all time. I would probably save that for the iPhone 4 or maybe even the iPhone 10 more recently, but with something like the iPhone 5, this was a pretty beautiful phone. It had so much capability at that point, and it's still kind of impressive just because anytime I pick it up or I do anything with it, it is actually still a pretty, good feeling phone in the hand. It still has a pretty decent camera for this day and age and when it came out. And it's actually turning 10 years old this year too. So it's kind of like the 10-year anniversary, man. That's pretty cute, you know what I mean? So let's go and start off with the outside. Like I mentioned, I wouldn't buy this phone anymore. If you want to buy some phones, I would recommend this year. Links will be down in the description. Get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now on the front of this phone, we actually do have a 4-inch IPS panel on the front. It's 640 by 1136, and I don't think the panel is bad. I don't think it's like a really ugly panel. It's just a smaller panel than what I'm used to, but also there's a ton of bezel around it. This panel reminds me a lot of something like an iPhone XR panel, where it's really not an ugly panel, but it is an IPS, and it is a low resolution. So those are some minor things to keep in mind. Now you do have that home button on the front, which like I mentioned before, I'm a fan of. I love having home buttons, and it has the home button on the front, which like I mentioned before, I like gesture-based design, but this thing came out in 2012, so it's totally understandable. You have the lightning port at the bottom, and this is important. This was not only the first time we got a bigger sized increase to that 4-inch panel, but this was the first time we saw a lightning port on our iPhones. So this was a legendary thing because even now 10 years later, we still have lightning ports on all of our iPhones, and it looks like Apple would go portless before they actually go put a lightning port or USB Type-C on their iPhone. So this iPhone kind of originated it. We also had the headphone jack on the bottom too, which is really cool. And this phone also had the flat sides around it, which also looked really beautiful at that time and even still looks very beautiful. Now on the back, this was a very interesting choice from Apple. So they actually had, two glass shards at the top and bottom, and the middle was aluminum. Before they had glass backs on their two previous iPhones, this one they decided to go this way, which I still think looks pretty nice and it feels really good in the hand, but I think I would have liked glass back at that time, but it's totally okay. But we also have that single camera setup on the back too. Now you don't have IP certification, you do not have wireless charging, you don't have MagSafe capabilities, you really don't have a lot going for this device in terms of features right now compared to this day and age, but at that time, this was Apple's only flagship. They didn't have different sizes at that time. They didn't even have the 5C model that came out the next year. This was the flagship. If you wanted to go to the Apple Store, buy the best iPhone, you had one option, which was this one. So I think that was totally okay. Let's go ahead on the cameras. We had that single 8 megapixel camera on the back, and you could do 1080p video on it. It was a standard lens. You had the LED flash as well. And even now, I don't think it's a bad camera. I think that's the best way to put it. It just so happens that it misses out on a lot of features that we have nowadays, but also it just doesn't really, take the best photos or the best videos. But surprisingly, anytime I really use this camera, if I really wanted to, I could probably get some decent photos or videos out of it. Obviously, you'd be able to tell it was an older phone, but I don't think you would think it was an iPhone 5 photo taking that specific, photo. I think you would think it's maybe like an iPhone 10 photo in bad condition or something, but I don't think a lot of people would realize it was actually, this phone that was taking those photos or videos. Now on the front, we have a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, and again, I don't think it's a bad camera either. When you have a phone like this, you kind of get used to the front camera not being the best quality, and in this specific case, it really isn't that bad. I wish this thing maybe had a 7 megapixel front-facing camera or something, but again, 2012, this phone came out 3 years before we even had 4K video on our iPhones, so totally understandable, and in my opinion, this is still a pretty decent camera when you think of the price and you think of the, day it was released in 2012. If Apple made a camera like this today, it would be horrible. But because this phone is as old as it is, it's totally understandable in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, longevity wise, this phone is already outdated. I'm pretty sure everyone knows this. This phone ended off with iOS 10, which isn't a bad version to end off with. It did get a random software update, if you guys remember, a couple of years ago. That was completely random. I think it was 2019. I don't even know why that happened, but that freaked me out, and I love that Apple did that. In this specific case, I don't really think this iPhone is completely worth it just because of that standpoint. But like I mentioned, it's okay. It still kind of has some software support. In terms of the applications, it has no software support from Apple natively, but some apps are still getting software update. But like I mentioned, iOS 11 was a pretty big update. This phone did not get it. So because of that, a lot of those apps do not support, the iPhone 5 anymore. So that's another really big thing to keep in mind too. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance, this is kind of the weird thing about this iPhone. It has that Apple A6 chip inside of it with a 1GB of RAM, and this was I think the first iPhone to bring 1GB of RAM too. And the craziest thing about this iPhone is the performance is still kind of decent. It's not a great performing iPhone. I don't want to get that in your head. It is pretty dated, as you guys know, but I'm surprised how good of a job this iPhone still does in this day and age. Now for lighter apps, if you're doing things like, note-taking and iMessaging people and, Snapchatting people on Twitter and stuff like that, I think this isn't a bad performing iPhone. I mean, it's definitely not that great. I do plan on using this iPhone for a little bit of time this year to make another video about it, but I do think if you're somebody who wants to go and use a phone for the very basic necessities, you still have some capability here. The only problem is, like I mentioned, a lot of apps you can't download the latest versions, but also a lot of these phones, I mean, they just don't have that much capability. And because a lot of the features that I use nowadays were built in with like iOS 12, 13, 14 software, you can't really do that on this phone. So that's a pretty big disadvantage. And there's a lot of iMessage things and FaceTime things that are now on our phones natively that we didn't have on this phone. So even if you can download the apps and you can maneuver through them and download and play them and all that stuff, you're still missing out on a lot of features there too. So I don't want to give the impression this is like a perfect phone, but I'm surprised how well of a performing phone this is. And that's the best way to put it. Because of how old it is kind of impressive. But like I mentioned, if Apple made a phone this year that performed this same way, it would not be that great of a phone. The biggest things I slip out on is like when you're closing applications, that definitely shows its age. If you're opening up apps, it takes a long time. But once the apps are loaded, like I mentioned with a lot of other older phones, they typically keep the job done, and I'm usually okay with it. I usually don't have like a horrible experience with these iPhones because I remember how old they are. But if I had to use them on an everyday basis, I probably could, but I would not want to do it. I wouldn't be super happy about it either. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this is probably the other horrible aspect of this phone right now. It has a 1440 mAh battery, and the problem with something like an iPhone 5 in this day and age is that it just really isn't that great of a performing phone anymore in terms of the battery life. Not only has this battery massively degraded, it's probably at like 40% right now, but I do experience random shutdowns and the charger port just doesn't really work that well. And that's the price you're paying when you get an older phone like this. If this was a brand new iPhone 5, that'd be different. But because 99% of the iPhone 5s people are probably looking at right now, they're already used for many, many years, it really isn't that great of a battery life, and that is one of the bigger disadvantages with this phone. So in terms of that covers it up there too. And to be completely honest, I really don't think the iPhone 5 is worth it in 2022 anymore if you're planning on buying this phone and using it. But like I mentioned, the interesting thing about this phone is that it's not a bad phone when you think of the age of it. For a 10-year-old phone, that is a very impressive device. You can still kind of do some things on it. And it's not crazy. The iPhone 5 was supported with software not too long ago, but the weird thing is when you look at the iPhone 6s that came out 3 years after this phone, that is still supported with software, and that phone is going to be a much more legendary phone than the iPhone 5. So at the very least, I wouldn't even recommend buying a 6s, and the lowest iPhone I'd recommend buying this year is the iPhone 7 or iPhone 7 Plus. The iPhone 5 is too old of a phone to recommend now, but you don't have to buy the latest iPhone. Go buy an iPhone 7 or 7 Plus, and I'm pretty sure you're going to have a great time with that too. So in terms of that covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.